edition of Immigration Nation. My name is immigration lawyer Nicole Whitaker. I'm here with Adriana Jimenez, another immigration lawyer at our firm. Our office is located in Towson, Maryland, but we represent clients all over the country. If you have an immigration case and would like to schedule your consultation with us, give us a call at 410-207-9272. Today, we're talking about one of our favorite types of cases called the T visa. The T visa is a way for people to get a work permit and green card inside the US without leaving the country if they have had bad experiences with either a current or former employer inside the US. We've had clients eligible for a T visa after working in all different types of industries. We've had clients who worked in housekeeping, construction, babysitters, farms or other agricultural jobs, people who worked in convenience stores, um, even someone who worked in a church. Recently, we got a T visa approval for a family of, I think, five. Um, Based on the father's employment at a church that mistreated him here in the United States. So, Adriana, what are some of the elements of a T visa, or what are some ways that someone might be eligible for a T visa case?
Yeah, so under the law, the applicant must show that he or she was a survivor of a severe form of trafficking. So this includes, like you mentioned, both labor or sex trafficking. And that's basically the main element of the T visa.
Yeah, for anybody who has been threatened, um, anyone who has had an employer be physically aggressive toward them, make them feel like if they were to quit their job, the employer would retaliate against them in some ways. Sometimes, well, oftentimes, in this situation, employers are taking advantage of undocumented immigrants because they're undocumented, because they don't have immigration papers, and they use that against them by saying, well, I know you're undocumented. If you don't come into work this Saturday, even though it's not the day we agreed you'd be working, you might get deported. We might call immigration on you. You don't know what could happen to you if you don't show up to work. Whether they make overt threats to report them to immigration, or insinuate or make jokes about their immigration status, all of those things result in this scheme or this pattern that makes the immigrant applicant for the T visa feel like they have to continue working. They don't have a choice to quit, because if they do, they're going to suffer serious consequences.
Right. And I think a lot of these victims or survivors ultimately, they don't know that they have any rights because they may be new to this country, or they may think they don't have any rights because they are undocumented, but that's not reality. That there's different ways that they can, one, receive help from authorities, from law enforcement. This is something that is illegal and shouldn't happen. And then the immigration benefit is you can receive a T visa and ultimately work permit and a potentially residency after all this has happened to you.
So, Adriana, tell us about one of the T visa cases you're working on right now.
Yeah, so we have one client. He worked at a dairy farm, and in his job, he was hired on to work for work a reasonable hour, at reasonable shift. And then ultimately it became more and more work. He started to being asked to come in, or not being asked, required to come in on Saturdays. And on Saturdays, it was during an hour where he didn't even normally come in. He normally worked a morning shift, a really early morning shift, from starting at like 4 a.m. But on Saturdays, his employer would make him come in at 7 p.m. and work into the next morning. And his employer would threaten him with different things, with calling immigration. His employer would tell him that he couldn't take days off if our client ever asked for anything or any accommodation or anything like that. The employer he normally carried a gun on his person. And this was one of those factors, one of those intimidation factors. He wouldn't say anything, but he would take out his gun and place it on the desk or place it nearby wherever they were. And the employer would often tell our client that he was ready to use it whenever necessary, whether on the farm or against anyone who would try to do anything to him. And so our client was really scared, and thankfully he consulted with us, and we were able to work through these issues and explain to him, like, these things are not okay, and this is a benefit that you can receive because you have gone through all these things. And as time went on the case, we learned more and more. And, at first it's just surface level things that we learn. And then as the client begins to have confidence in us, they start to release all these different details and really get into, something that is really harmful and shouldn't be happening.
Yeah, I think that the intimidation is a really good word. I think that sums up that scheme or pattern where the employer puts the employee in a position where they feel like they have to do what they're told. They don't have the autonomy to say no. They don't have the ability to quit the job because they're afraid they'll suffer consequences if they do.
Right. And that was part of it. He had a family to care for, and his employer knew that. And his employer would tell him, whenever he would say that he wanted to, or I think at some point he wanted to obtain another job and he had an interview. Somehow the employer found out, and he threatened our client with saying, if you try to leave, I'm going to tell all your future employers that you're an awful employee and that, you don't show up on time, things like that, things to really hurt his reputation as an employee. And that's just part of the cycle of violence that he had to go through. And ultimately he was able to escape from this employer. But and I'm really glad that he did, because now he can apply for this benefit.
Yeah. And the cases we're talking about today, they're all in different stages of the process. I know one of the cases we're going to talk about, the case is already approved and the client is now applying for the green card. Another case, we're about to file this case. What's the status of this case right now?
So we have a client who he's in the U.S. and he has children outside of the U.S. and they're already over 21, so they're adult children. And he's been in this country for 20 plus years, and he qualifies for this special exception that I think a lot of people may not be aware of. But basically, if you have a child who is, so let me try to break this down a little bit clearer. So he's filing a petition for his spouse who's also out of the country, and that spouse is called his derivative. With his spouse, he has children who are adults now, and because normally, since they're adults, they would not be considered derivatives. They cannot be added to his application because they're already over 21. But there is an exception, and it's called they would receive T6, trafficking visa under T6. And because they are his wife's derivative, the derivative's child, even if they're adult child, they are now going to be able to be included. So, depending on multiple factors in T visas, you can include your spouse, your children, your parents, depending on your age, siblings under 18. So we can get a lot of different people in under this T visa, even though maybe you think that they've already, you're too old, or they may not qualify, but speaking to an experienced attorney will help determine whether they do or not. And most likely they will, and we can bring them in as well. So we're about to send out his petition this week. So we are really excited about including his children, his adult children, who weren't going to have any kind of benefit otherwise if it weren't for this exception.
Mm-hmm. And this client is also in removal proceedings. He has a case in immigration court, and I believe that's actually why he consulted with us in the first place. He had a case, he had a notice to appear in immigration court, and he was looking for representation. And there weren't any other options for him to get legal status or win his case in immigration court to stay in the US. But through our intake and screening process, we were able to learn about these experiences that happened in his past with his former employer. And through this process, it was almost a blessing that he was placed in removal proceedings, because he sought out a lawyer, he consulted with us, he learned about the T visa. Now, through this process, we'll be able to win his case in immigration court. Not only do that, but get a work permit for him and his family members, and ultimately green cards.
Yeah, and I think it's important to note that even, some people may think that they're not eligible for something like this, even though because they're removal proceedings. So just because you're in court and you're fighting your case doesn't mean that you can apply for certain benefits. And T visa is one of them. We can apply for T visa separately from your immigration proceedings. So that's a good tip to remember.
Yeah. This client is not the only client who has worked in agriculture. Another case we're going to talk about also happened on a farm, not a dairy farm, but a horse farm. In this other case, our client came to the U.S. more than 10 years ago, a long time ago. He was maybe 16, he was a teenager, and for years his family members had been coming to the US to work at this horse farm. And they sent him to come serve a couple years to work in this horse farm. And especially because he was so young, he was influenced by the farmer that ran this farm. At that time, they were cracking down on the borders, and it became more and more difficult for people to enter the US without inspection. And his family members, his uncles and his cousins that were coming and going, they all ended up leaving, going back to Mexico. And he was the last person from his family that ended up living on this farm by himself with the farmer. And in that time, he experienced a lot of these different kind of factors that in the beginning intimidated him into remaining at the farm, not looking for other work, not going back to his home country. And ultimately, over time, he developed a relationship with the farmer, and the farmer used that against him to continue the cycle where our client, the employee, felt like he didn't have any other options but to stay at this farm. It was a really rural farm. There weren't a lot of businesses around. He didn't have transportation, and there are no Ubers, there's no taxis in the area, and so he relied on the farmer to take him into town if he needed groceries, if he needed to wash his clothes, if he was unable to get the farmer to take him into town. He had to wash his own clothes in the washer and dryer where they washed the blankets for the horses with horse manure and things like that. The trailer that he lived in was hot. It wasn't a good situation, but he didn't have any other options. And this farmer would tell him, "You're lucky to have this job," and he would criticize the employee and make him feel like he was never doing a good job. He'd always tell him he was doing something wrong. He'd yell at him if he made a mistake. this farmer was a really nasty guy. He would yell and get aggressive, not just with this employee, but with um, the public, with the other people that came to the farm. And our client saw how nasty he was, and he felt like he had to do what this person said to stay in line and not get in trouble, because he knew that he was undocumented. And this farmer was such a nasty person, he was afraid that he could report him to immigration or have him deported if he didn't do what he was told. The farmer would um, also feed into this fear of immigration by saying, well, you better not go into town without me. You don't know if the police are going to catch you, and they'll lock you up and deport you right back to Mexico. Um, Whenever our client would have to leave the farm, he had to call his employer, let him know when he was leaving, where he was going, let him know when he got there, let him know when he was coming back. So this employer was constantly keeping tabs on his employee to make sure he knew where he was at all times. And all of this happened, remember, when he was a teenager. He was really young, his first jobs. He had just entered the US. He didn't know anything differently. And our client continued to work there for 10 years. And over time, maybe things were not always super hostile, but it was because the employer created in the very beginning of the relationship um, this kind of dynamic where the employee was intimidated and he felt like he had to comply or he was going to get in trouble. If not, in trouble with the farmer, in trouble with immigration or the police in this super rural town. Um, there were times when he would be injured on the farm and the farmer refused to take him to a doctor or the hospital. The farmer had him use tape to, instead of a band-aid or stitches, going to the hospital for stitches, had him use tape or super glue, or in one case he even had a friend come to the farm and treat him because they wanted to keep quiet the situation that the farmer was employing an undocumented worker, and also kind of continue to foster that sense of fear in our client that if he left the farm, sought help, even medical help or medical treatment, he was going to be at risk of getting deported.
Yeah. And it's funny that you mentioned that detail, because sometimes as we're working these cases, we see patterns, and some of the patterns overlap. So in the previous case we were talking about, same thing. Our client who worked on a dairy farm, but he was hurt. His employer wouldn't let him seek any kind of medical help. And eventually he had to, because he had to have like surgery. So he had surgery and he was ordered to have to be on bed rest for about, or to be resting for about 9 to 10 days. But his employer made him return to work before those 9 or 10 days, and the our client didn't feel like he had any other choice but to report to work, or he would have to face the consequences. And he was really afraid of what his employer was capable of. And I think that's similar to the second case. Is, they're threatened, and the employee, our clients, are afraid of them because of everything that they have instilled in them.
Yeah, it's definitely the theme is these employers are taking advantage of undocumented in the US because they don't have any other options, and they already have this of um, fear of being deported, being sent back to the countries where they left. So ultimately, this case at the horse farm, our client found us. We screened him for the T visa over several meetings. We helped draft his declaration. We filed the T visa application. It was approved And now he is in the process of applying for his green card, so that he can have status in the US, continue to live in the US, where he has a US citizen wife and child. Um, I imagine that once he gets his green card, he'll be really looking forward to traveling back home to Mexico. He hasn't been there since, um, I want to say, maybe 15 years. Um, so I'm sure that'll be exciting for him once he has that green card, or even a um, permission to travel so that he can visit his family that he hasn't seen in a long time.
Amazing. And it should be noted that whenever you have a T, once your T visa is granted and you apply for your residency, part of that residency application process includes a travel document. So you could travel as soon as you apply for your residency to your home country, which in this case has been years since he was a kid, since he was 16 years old,
Yeah.
which is going to be great.
Tell us about another TVSA case that you're working on, Adriana.
So I jumped the gun a little bit. I started talking to you guys about the T6 exception. So that was my client who we're going to file this week, and we're going to petition for so many people because they all are going to be included. So we're filing a petition for him, for his wife, and for his 2 kids who are over 21. So 4 people total are going to receive a benefit as a result of the trafficking that he had to endure here in the U.S. And he has a similar story. He has been in the U.S. since he was young. I think 20 years that he hasn't been back to his home country. And we're really looking forward to getting that T visa, getting a decision and approval on that T visa. And once the T visa is approved, he is living in the country, so he will have permission to work and live freely here. And when his the T visa is approved along with his family members, they will be able to travel to the US on that T visa. So he'll be reunited with his wife and his 2 adult kids, which will be really exciting.
Yeah, that's amazing. So sometimes derivatives of TVSA cases are here inside the US, other times they're outside the US, in which case the process starts out the same. We file an I-914 Supplement A. For people that are inside the US, once the case is approved, the derivatives will get their work permit and they'll be eligible to apply for a green card at the same time as the principal applicant. For clients who have family members outside of the US, once the case is approved, then that case goes to another office that will start the process for those derivatives to be able to enter the US with legal status. Once they enter the US, they'll have authorization to work as well until the time that they can apply for their green cards.
Yeah, so the whole time that they are waiting to apply for their green card, they're going to be reunited, dad with his kids and his wife. So that's really, really great. We're very excited for that.
Yeah. Adriana, anything else you want to share with us about these T visa applications, or anything else that you're working on?
No, but if you know anybody, or if you've experienced anything like this, give us a call and we can speak to you, discuss if this is even a possibility for you. And it may be, you may think that this is something that's normal, and that's what these employers do, is normalize these situations. But we are here to help. We're here to flesh through your situation and help you.
Absolutely. A lot of times people think that, well, maybe this won't apply to them because the situation with their employer happened so many years ago, or maybe they think it won't apply to them because they only worked for a short period of time with an employer that mistreated them. But what you should know is that it doesn't matter when this situation happened with your employer. Um, we want to hear about it, and we want to see if there's some way that we can help you get your work permit and green card through this program if you've been mistreated by an employer. There's no requirement that it happened within a certain period of time. there's no requirement that you work for that employer for so long. If you've ever experienced a situation with an employer where they mistreat you, lied to you, tricked you, tried to intimidate you, harass you, threaten to report you to immigration, threaten your families, threaten to retaliate against you if you quit, anything like that, you could be eligible for a work permit and green card for you and possibly your family. So as Adriana said, give us a call at 410-207-9272 to schedule your consultation with our consultation team. We represent clients all over the country. So give us a call and we look forward to hearing from you.